A good Sunday morning to you, and thank you for watching Eye on New Mexico. Joining me today, Mike Frese, the Republican running for House of Representatives, hopefully to represent New Mexico's 1st District. He is going up against Democrat Michelle Lujan Grisham, who we spoke to on this program last weekend. Now, Mike, thank you for being here today.
Glad to be here.
Yes, and we spoke briefly, very briefly, after your primary win in June. In fact, probably just hours after you won, you appeared on our morning show.
I don't know that I'd been to sleep yet.
Exactly. So I'm hoping today, of course, we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more in depth about you and why you want to go represent New Mexico in Washington. So let's start with that. Just a little more background on yourself. You have a science and engineering background as opposed to the political background we often see.
Right. I've lived in New Mexico for 55 years. I've lived in this district for 35 years. I got a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from New Mexico State. Met my wife there. We were married 44 years ago. We came back to Albuquerque after we'd gone east. I got a PhD in applied math from MIT. Came back here, worked for a company, worked at the university a little while, and then started my own business. So I have a research and development business where we do very complicated things, computer modeling of experiments which go on in New Mexico called pulsed power experiments. We've worked for Sandy a little bit, Los Alamos a little bit, the Air Force Research Laboratory quite a lot. And we've done very interesting work. I've worked alongside those scientists and engineers from those laboratories for years. Many of them are my friends and colleagues, and I'm proud to have had all of that experience with those New Mexico laboratories, which really helps me understand their capabilities and mission.
Yeah, and absolutely, they're affected greatly by what decisions made in Congress and in Washington. Was that something that prompted you, some of your experiences, to seek to run for office?
Well, it's a sidelight, actually, because the reason that I felt I had to step up is that the economy of the country got so bad, and I could see clearly that the reason was inept management, an attempt to control everything from Washington, D.C. And I felt that we really needed to free people up to learn, so they get out and produce the things they want to produce, do the jobs they want to do for others. I just believe that if we all are more free, we'll do better for ourselves, and the better we do for ourselves, the better off everybody else will be.
Yeah, you know, we mentioned you're not a politician, you haven't run for political office in the past, and that's somewhat rare to see, although we do see it happening more and more, I think. People like yourself deciding that their leaders aren't working for them, even the leaders within their own political parties. Is that true?
I guess I agree with all of that, and I think that business background is really very important to leading the country and to pushing back against some of this regulation that we have, which is stifling our job growth and our prosperity. So I think the business background is more important for leadership in Congress today than ever before, and it's certainly more important than, believe it or not, to most people, than having held public office before.
As a businessman yourself, you certainly probably represent the business community here. You've seen things that they've seen. How about the rest of us here? Why do you think voters chose you in the primary, for example?
I stood up in the primary for freedom, economic freedom, and for more prosperity and for restoring the American dream, which really used to be the birthright of every American. So the voters in the primary thought that I was, I guess, the man to go to Congress and to carry those ideas up to Congress. They're sadly less and less what drives Congress to do things. So we need a government and a regulatory apparatus that leaves us more alone than this one does. We shouldn't have to ask for permission for everything we do.
So obviously the economy and creating jobs, that kind of thing, a huge focus. We're going to get back to that in a second because everything comes back to the economy, certainly. But I wanted to bring up a big issue we talked about with your opponent last weekend with Michelle Lujan Grisham, the immigration concerns happening right now. Now, this has been an issue for a long time, what to do about immigration reform in this country, and only recently we have been reporting on the influx of Central American immigrants here. You know, let's talk first about that. Do you think Congress, obviously they're not seeming to take any action anytime soon. They only have a little bit of time before they go on recess in August. What do you think needs to be done most immediately, perhaps, to stem the wave of illegal immigration here?
So stemming the tide is the key thing. I mean, the numbers are important. Before, I guess in 2011, about 6,000 Central American immigrants came. The next year in 2012, or somewhere in the late 2011 or 2012, the president signed his deferred action on children, took out his pen, wrote an order, somehow took a picture of it with his cell phone and sent it over to the other agencies, and we got a rule which changed our law dramatically. And the change in that law sparked rumors throughout, I think, the Americas, but certainly in Central America, where it was known that since they were not citizens of Mexico, those people could come and get a hearing on asylum, and they found out that we were going to give them a paper and put them out on the street, and with that paper they were going to go anywhere in the nation they wanted to go. And they were going to have to show up, most likely, for 2 years, if at all. If they could be found, they might be made to show up again. But that law was passed a long time ago, and we have that. We have that law. We really need, I think, in order to stem the tide, it would be best to change that law so that those people are treated like citizens of Mexico or Canada, the contiguous countries. But in order to stem the tide, the really important thing for us to do is to give them an immediate hearing and send them back if they don't qualify for asylum. If they don't have reason why they ought to be given political asylum, then they need to go back to Central America. And if we have to take them to get them there, well, that's fine. And I think as we do that, what will happen is the realization will spread in those countries that you can spend your money hiring a coyote and you can get to the United States, but you aren't going to be allowed to stay unless you have a really cogent argument for political asylum.
Yeah.
And I think that will keep people from spending their money and taking the risk and coming on the trip. And I think that's what's needed. If we don't do that, we're not going to stem the tide.
You know, it seems actually like Democrats and Republicans are saying something similar along those lines, with saying that we have to do something there. We have to tell those countries and the people in those countries, you can't come here and stay here necessarily. But the issue has become so emotional, and especially even on the two political party sides, you'll see people saying, well, you know, the horrors that people are facing in these countries, how can you be so heartless and send them back? Emotions drive a lot of politics, I'm sure, but what do you think about that?
Well, I think life in Central America is bad for some people and good for others and in between for others, and I think it may be on the average worse. There may be governments down there, and we're all sympathetic with those people for having a government that doesn't help the poor, and it tends to oppress their economy and destroy their economy. But we simply can't put the burden on our working families of taking all of those people in. We can't take all of the people out of those Central American countries, all those children, and destroy their future, and at the same time burden our working families with their support. So we really can't afford, we can afford to have the 100,000 that are going to come this year and take care of them that way, but next year, if it doubles, it's 200,000, 250,000, maybe the year after that, 500,000, maybe the year after that, 1 million. We can't afford that. We can't as a nation. We don't want our working families to be burdened by their care.
I think most would agree something has to be done to figure out what we're going to do at this point so that things don't get even worse later on. So that is a great point. Now, immigration is a wider topic. Of course, many people will say we definitely want to encourage people to come here if they have ideas to innovate our economy from all countries of the world.
Right.
What's your position on sort of a broader level of immigration reform? Are there ways we can make it work better for our country?
Well, I don't know about you, but 500 years ago, my ancestors weren't here. So I'm an immigrant. My family, my father's family came from Germany probably in the mid-1800s, so to Illinois. And we're a nation of immigrants. Immigration has built this country. Immigration helps us have a more vibrant economy. We need people who have things to bring to our nation, and we need to have a certain measured amount of immigration, but we need to have it for the benefit of the country, and we need not to be keeping people who come here in violation of the law. So we had a law which granted amnesty in 1987 called Simpson-Mazzoli. I'm sure you remember. And
I've heard of it. I was young then, but yes.
Yeah, I'm sure you remember reading about it. So it granted amnesty to millions of people who were here illegally, and it was supposed to put in place a barrier around the workplace, if you will, which would prevent employers from hiring illegal workers. And legal workers, I mean people who are born here, citizens, or people with green cards, or legal employees. Beyond that, unless we've permitted someone into this country legally, they really shouldn't be hired. I actually can't tell you why we don't enforce those provisions of Simpson-Mazzoli, but we don't. We have laws on the books we don't enforce, and I think that most people in this country are very doubtful that this government, this administration, is going to enforce any laws as written. And we have just all these examples of things that are written one way and then enforced another. We had a Supreme Court decision yesterday, I guess, about a law that was written in health care that says one thing, and the president and the executive branch, we're enforcing completely another. So we'll get firm decision on that from the Supreme Court before too very long. But I don't see how we cut a comprehensive immigration deal, thousands of pages and ifs, ands, and buts, and we don't ever put in place a process to enforce those laws. I don't see a comprehensive deal where we give up amnesty now in favor of some enforcement of some other laws down the road is ever going to be a good thing. We need to get the enforcement in place now. I think enforcing Simpson-Mazzoli, figuring out what the courts did and what the administration did, and getting it so we enforce Simpson-Mazzoli. First, put a wall around the workplace which doesn't let people who aren't legal work here unless they have a photo ID or maybe facial recognition software or something on that order, some technology that makes it possible to enforce it.
So a little bit of a taste of what we could see you pushing for, certainly if you end up going to Washington. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about a few other issues with Mike Frese, candidate for Congress. Stay with us. Thanks again for staying with us for Eye on New Mexico this morning. We are talking to Mike Frese, the Republican candidate for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. He will be taking on Michelle Lujan Grisham in the fall. We're already taking her on, of course, campaign season underway already. Or it's always campaign season, especially in Congress every 2 years. Right, yeah. Why would you get into a cycle like that? I always wonder.
No comment.
It's a tough job, and I think that's why we see some people like yourself, people without the political background, trying to get in and make some changes.
Well, there's that, but there's also just the feeling that the country really needs to go in a different direction, that we're going in the wrong direction, and we need to get back toward more freedom so that businesses can create jobs. Before we went to break, I misspoke. I said the Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, we wanted
it was
to
an
bring that
appeals
up.
court decision of the appeals court, and we had two. One saying that the federal subsidies could not go to people who didn't go through a state health exchange, but came through a federal health exchange. And the law is pretty clear on that. It says capital S state, not health insurance exchange. So, but we had another appeals court decision which said, well, it was okay for the president to make this adjustment. So there will have to be a Supreme Court decision eventually, but not now. And I think I alluded to that in the closing.
Well, and there are so many questions about the health care law, different elements of it. Businesses that you've talked to have many concerns about it.
Yeah, the big thing is that many businesses are seeing huge increases in their premiums in order to have an Affordable Care Act compliant policy, and they're seeing that they're facing huge increases in their deductibles, which is untenable for people who have for these businesses who hire the young and have people stay with them for years and years, and what happens is they don't want to hire new employees. It drives down jobs. It's an example, a big example of where government regulation to the benefit of some destroys jobs and and hampers those very people it's helping in finding jobs. It's like, believe it or not, the minimum wage does the very same thing.
Yeah. Well, and your viewpoint on that would be that it's not encouraging those companies to then hire because they're paying that wage.
Exactly right. If you want to encourage people to hire, get out of controlling the price of labor and let the market decide. Nobody earns the minimum wage for very long, and very few people depend on it for their entire livelihood. Their
so
family
where's the balance on that, where clearly back in the day labor rules were put into place to protect people who were children who were working, unions were created to protect, to put in hour restrictions, so there were restrictions put into place, but where's the balance?
Well, it's not what we have today, that's for sure. And take unions, for example. I think 7% of private sector employees are in unions today. The percentage is higher in public sector. It's not even clear what the need is for unions in the public sector. You just don't have that countervailing interest in management that unions need to be there to protect workers against. Public sector unions don't have that to fight, and so why do we have public sector unions? Even Franklin Roosevelt thought public sector unions were a bad idea.
Back to healthcare.
Sure.
What would be a more an approach that might work? Because I think it's become part of our culture here to believe it, and I mean, obviously in some countries it's even more overreaching. But at least in America, we've come to expect some level of getting health insurance through our employees. It's become part of the reason many of us work.
Right.
What should companies be required to do?
I've had family members who, after they retired from their careers in big business, I mean, went to work at Walmart so they could have health insurance.
Yeah.
And really, I don't see anything wrong with that. I think if that's part of the compensation package and that's what you choose to work for, I think that's just fine. So I'm in favor of people having health insurance and their employers paying them enough, if not purchasing it for them, then paying them enough to purchase it for themselves. I think we've created a system where because there's a tax differential, it presently is paid for by the employer. But if employees could submit the bills to the employer and the employer would pay them for that or whatever, I think that would all be possible system. And having a different system where maybe there wasn't the difference in taxation for individuals who buy health insurance versus the companies who buy it for the employees, we might have a fairer system. We need more free market approaches. So the truth is, remember that states are called laboratories for democracy. Well, they're laboratories for economics and they're laboratories for regulation, and we need the federal government to back off, go hands off, and say, let's let the states experiment with this. Let's find out what works. There are states that have systems that people like.
Sure, everyone.
And now they've lost that. through the interference of the federal government. So I think more freedom from Washington, D.C. Is the ideal plan.
Going back to what you mentioned earlier in the show, that you did a lot of work with Sandia and the labs here, engineering background, you've done work with the Department of Defense and Department of Energy with some of these companies that we mentioned do rely heavily on the federal government. They contribute a lot too, of course. So, you know, kind of bringing us to New Mexico's economy, where we always seem to be talking about how much we rely on the federal government, federal dollars here. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? Do we need to reform the economy here in New Mexico? And as a congressman, you may not have as much power specifically over New Mexico's economy, but give us some thoughts on that.
Taking the words out of my mouth. The federal government ought to have less control over New Mexico's economy. When New Mexico sells services through Los Alamos and Sandia to the nation, I think there's a mission there that needs to be accomplished, and New Mexico provides a service to the nation for that income. Now, that's not the biggest part of the money that comes from the federal government to New Mexico. The biggest part of the money that comes is for social services, Medicaid, food stamps. Our economy in this state is, well, if New Mexico, it's tough to say, it's hard to face, but if New Mexico's an experiment, a laboratory for economics, it's a failed experiment. And we need something to happen locally in New Mexico's legislature. I mean, the governor's trying hard, but still saddled by state laws passed by former governors and state legislatures, and we simply have too much regulation from Santa Fe. That's one of the reasons I want to go to Washington, D.C. I don't believe that Santa Fe has all the answers for New Mexico, and I sure don't want Santa Fe-style government from Washington, D.C., because it would be bad for the nation. If New Mexico's going to have a growing, vibrant economy, it needs a growing, vibrant national economy in which to survive.
Yeah, great point. Sticking on the economic subject for a second here, and regulation, can you give us a few specifics for, you know, especially for anyone who is involved in business? They definitely know some of this already, but would there be any easy fixes right now at a federal level perhaps that could really free things up? Well,
I would say we have a lot of interference in the oil patch because of the Endangered Species Act. So I believe that a good approach would be to put riders onto the appropriations bills for the agencies that enforce the Endangered Species Act, to say that states with, say, GDP to per capita GDP numbers below, you know, in the bottom 5%, bottom 10% of the nation, those states should have the opportunity to get waivers from those restrictions on the Endangered Species Act, which tend to bar economic activity in the oil patch. Something like that could help a lot. There have been studies which look carefully at what percentage of people move from the bottom 20% of the income level to the top 20%, and really the counties in New Mexico that do the very best, the metropolitan areas, the economic areas that do best, are in the oil patch in the southeast, where people have a reasonable probability of making that transition. If you show up every day and can pass a drug test, they will train you to do a job which will make you well above the poverty line. In fact, above the median income down in Hobbs and Artesia. And in the Northwest, we have similar economic problems and similar interactions with the federal government. I mean, the Environmental Protection Agency is running wild, trying to shut down every coal power plant in the country. And if we had similar amendments to the appropriations bills, which said no money from this bill may be spent on enforcing rules in these disadvantaged states, or maybe just say no money from these appropriations bills can be spent on rules that have the force of law, enforcing them as if they were law, unless they've been voted on by Congress and signed by the President. So there are some things we could do that could have an immediate effect on the economy of New Mexico.
With not too much time left this morning, do you think that you have like-minded individuals from other states in Congress right now, running for Congress, that could turn things in a way that you would see Congress getting something done, as opposed to what we often see, which is stopgap measures, delays on things, just nothing happening?
Well, the House of Representatives is presently in pretty good hands. Because of the election that happens for the speaker's not always the most conservative or the least conservative guy in Congress. He's someplace in the middle. You've asked me about other people from other states, but I want to focus on one from our state, and that's Steve Pearce. I support Steve Pearce. I have for years, and I will continue to do so once I stand alongside him in Congress and in the caucus. And so I'm generally in agreement with Steve Pearce's policies. I can't say that I can't speak for him and say he's in agreement with everything I say, but I know that I support mostly what Steve Pearce has supported. And there are congressmen from other states whose ideas I enjoy. I have for years been member of and a supporter of Club for Growth nominees, and there are a lot of those congressmen that I've met who I support. So yeah, there are good conservatives in Congress, and I'm for those people. And
certainly people can check out more on them, Club for Growth, and find out a little more about yourself by going to your website. Mike Frese, thanks for being here this morning to get a little better idea of who you are and why you're running. Good luck in the campaign, and we'll see you next weekend for another Eye on New Mexico.